completely forgotten I've given it that one, so we'll go with that one. That sounds much more interesting than the one that I've got on there. Yeah, my name's Joe Harper. I'm with the Wild Oysters Project, and yeah, we're basically looking at reintroducing the native oyster to seas around the UK really, but specifically looking at the North East. And yeah, I'll chat about why we need to do that. I'll chat about why oysters are considered superheroes of the sea. I hope you'll agree with me at the end of this that they really are incredible animals, much more incredible than we give them credit for. And yeah, what it is that we're doing and how, most importantly, how you really can help us, because you can. I think more so than a lot of other projects. The people around here are really important. So, the native oyster. When I do this with school groups, I sort of say to people, what's an oyster? I won't insult your intelligence. I presume most of us are aware vaguely of what an oyster is, but the native oyster is a little bit different to the ones that you're probably aware of. So it's Ostreoregulus is our native oyster. That is the only one species of oyster that should be in the UK. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of other species of oyster in the UK at the moment, but that's a species that should be here. It's a sessile bivalve mollusk. Sessile meaning it doesn't move, which makes it relatively unique actually. There's lots of bivalve mollusks that do move. Mussels, for example, are able to walk around on little legs and things and all that kind of stuff. Oysters can't do that. They're completely, once they're stuck, they're stuck. There's almost 30 species that we get in the UK, over 200 worldwide. Say there should only be one. And lots of different names for the native oyster. Native oyster, flat oyster, European oyster. I'll use a variation of those three. Just know I am talking about the same species. I just forget sometimes which one I started with. And then, yeah, anyway, native European oyster. Incredible animals. Not very big, around 10, maybe 20 centimetres, but rarely 10 to 12 centimetres, we usually say, fitting about the palm of your hand like that. So, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Just to give you a little bit of a background about the actual species we're looking at. So, we mentioned, or it was mentioned in the last presentation about ecosystem engineers, and that is what oysters really are. They're absolutely ecosystem engineers. They're reef builders. They do exactly the same job as coral reefs in the tropics. Incredible reef building. You can see on the bottom picture there, you can see some native oysters there sort of attaching in these really complex 3D shapes that create these nooks and crannies and things for other life to grow, and that's the real importance of them. These reefs can be absolutely massive and were absolutely massive. I think 2 weeks ago there's a Guardian article that came out saying that the reefs within the North Sea used to be big enough to cover the entirety of Northern Ireland. They're not that anymore. They're nowhere near that anymore. But they were that once upon a time. So yeah, they're incredible. They really were the backbone of marine life in the Northern Hemisphere. They were the coral reef equivalents in the colder waters. So yeah, that's their real importance. But they do a lot of other stuff as well, like all of these ecosystem services that I've happily got on this slide. So they increase our water quality, clarity absolutely amazingly. They are able to clear water to an exceptional degree. One oyster per day can clean from almost completely polluted water, as polluted you can get, to pure seawater 200 litres every single day. That's one oyster. Imagine 10,000 oysters, imagine 1 million oysters. When we start looking at the news and we start thinking about all of the water companies putting all this dirty water, all of this sewage into our rivers, imagine how much that would be mitigated if we had the oyster reefs that we used to have. They increase our fish production by providing a nursery for younger fish to live in, and also a nursery for their prey to live in as well, by enhancing the entire biodiversity of a region. They're completely self-sustaining. Young oysters will only settle on other oysters. Once you get a healthy sized oyster reef, that will sustain itself to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Almost indefinitely, it'll get bigger provided the habitat is there for it to do so. There's a real cultural value around oysters, one that we've forgotten about. Oysters 200 years ago were food for the poor, a really important food for the poor. They were high in protein and very, very, very cheap, which we'll talk about as we go on. In Sunderland, we used to have these oyster saloons, which I'll talk about later, where people from Scotland to London would travel specifically to Sunderland to eat northeast oysters because they were the best oysters. There used to be a house in the middle of Newcastle called Oyster Shell Hall, which was just a building that was encrusted with oyster shells all the way around. Down south, we have these oyster festivals where the king and the queen of the oyster march through the streets. Still to this day, in areas that oysters no longer exist, we still celebrate these oysters. So they really have this huge cultural value, which we'll talk about as we go on, but I don't think it can be understated, really, the cultural value these oysters used to have and the cultural value that we've forgotten over the years. Improving water quality, as I've already mentioned. Stabilising sediment is important. They're able to stop that sediment from moving, which protects our coastlines from flooding and from erosion. And the nitrification as well, which is sort of similar to that sort of improving the water quality, but it does stop that over-nutrification of our waters as well. So, they do a lot. They do a lot of stuff. They do a lot more stuff than people think. They're not just these rocks. They're not anything like what we think mussels are doing, where they're just a food for other animals. They are the backbone of our ecosystem, or certainly were for a long time. Oh, we're not moving on, because I'm pressing the wrong button. Oh, pretend you didn't see that. Right, this next slide, what you're going to see is a tank about here and a tank about here. The tank on your left, my right, is going to have some water in it from a marina, I forget which one, somewhere in the UK, and that's all it's got in it. The tank on the other side is going to have exactly the same amount of water from exactly the same marina, but with some European oysters in it. That's the only difference. There's no electronics happening here, there's nothing else. There's one with water, one with oysters. Over a 4-hour period, you're going to see a time lapse of those two tanks. I'm just going to let it speak for itself, because it is incredible. It's a very well-known experiment, and it's one that's been replicated a lot of times by ourselves a couple of weeks ago as well. And what you can really see there is just a few oysters in that short amount of time have cleaned that water from absolutely completely polluted, disgusting water, green, absolutely no water clarity, no lights getting through there for our primary producers, into pure, clean seawater, which is what we want ideally for our habitats to live in. So I think that's more powerful than I can sort of put into words about what these oysters are able to do, as well as being these reef builders. They clean water, absolutely exceptionally. And then we start talking about the reefs. So we've got this amazing clean water and all this biodiversity is able to live here, but where do they live? Well, they live on the oysters. The oysters are providing the habitat as well as the clarity. So we can boost this biodiversity incredibly. So you can see on these pictures, there's sea squirts down at the bottom there, we've got limpets, we've got lots of different bits of algae. On here you've got a lot of sea squirts and things as well, along with some little bryozoan type animals. And at the top you start seeing your larger invertebrates as well, your crabs and that kind of thing that are living on here that wouldn't be there were it not for our sort of native oyster reefs. So they're really creating this incredible habitat for all of these creatures that wouldn't be there, all of which are as important as each other. So they're creating the backbone for increased ecosystems. Again, you can see on that picture as well, you can see there's a load of blue mussels there that are living on the oysters because they've provided a structure for blue mussels to live on. Blue mussels need structures to live on, they can't just live on their own, so they need to live on those oysters. You can see again lots more sea squirts and things. You can see some young blue mussels there as well, and then lots of little bryozoans and sea sponges and that kind of thing on the other one. So we're starting to see how important they are. They're often related to corals, which is true, they are very similar to corals, but if you think about coral reefs, what you're thinking about is the corals themselves. You think about an oyster reef, you're not just thinking about the oysters, you think about all the stuff that's growing on the oysters. So to me, they can actually, an oyster, a singular oyster, can be a habitat as well as that reef as a whole. But they're on the way down as much as I'm sure with a lot of your talks. This is a very common theme, the depletion of the species that we're talking about. And this one is, I'm going to go on a limb and say probably the worst affected one that you've probably seen on one of these talks. 85% globally, 95% reduction in Europe over the last 200 years. I'd argue it's probably more than that, but 95% seems like a nice number that we use. One of the most threatened marine habitats in Europe. So we've got one of the most threatened species, one of the most threatened habitats, and path to destruction in the UK. In Scotland, they're probably our only sort of natural native oyster sites left. There's one or two little pockets up in Scotland. All of the rest are done purely through conservation efforts. That's the only reason that they're there. And they're there for a lot of reasons. Reason number one is overfishing. That can't be stated highly enough. That is the primary reason of our oyster reduction. Around 200 years ago, as I said, they were food for the poor. They cost 4 for a penny back then, and we just ate them all, basically. So we fished all the oysters out. We had all of the protein from there. We need to get more protein from the sea. So we invented industrial trawling, which destroys the habitat that the oysters live on. So that was the next step forward of our oyster destruction. Environmental conditions are also very important to sort of our loss in oysters. They do have a temperature range that they can live in, especially in those sort of more southern areas where temperatures are starting to warm up. Not necessarily here, I'm more talking about sort of the Med and places like that. We are starting to see oysters at the top of their temperature ranges. A skewed sex ratio. So an interesting thing about the European oyster and all oysters, they're all born male. They can then swap between male and female depending on what the reef wants. If we've got too many females, they'll start swapping to males. If we've got too many males, they'll start swapping to female, and vice versa, to try and get that 1-to-1 ratio as best that they can. Pollutants that we put in the water stop that from happening. It actually blocks the gene that allows that to happen, which means that we're getting far more males than we are females at the moment, which obviously means they're less able to breed. Pathogens that come out of sewage pipes, mainly through human and other animal feces. Invasive species, such as the Pacific oyster, which if you've ever eaten an oyster, it will be a Pacific oyster. A beautiful animal, an animal that does exactly the same things as the European oyster over in the Pacific Ocean, but it shouldn't be here, is the important thing. And it is starting to cause our European oysters to lose habitat, to be outcompeted and that kind of thing, sort of in a similar way to the grey and the red squirrels on land. The water quality and pollution, I have said that oysters do fix water quality or help to fix water quality. They can only do so much. They're not gods. There is a point where they're not able to survive either. So they can only do so much, and they will get harmed by that pollution as well. Dredging is also an important thing. I'm sure that we remember the shellfish dive and things like that, although it wasn't done by dredging as we're told, but we know it was. Dredging is obviously an issue with the oysters as well. That's destruction of habitat, but it's also that production of pollutants and pathogens out into the water that dredging can cause as well. Predation, less of an issue over here, but I am aware that on the west side of the country we're starting to see an increased number of spider crabs, which do predate on oysters, but there aren't too many oysters there at the moment anyway, so I'd say that's probably less of an issue that they've had, but it will become an increasing issue as we start to repopulate those oyster populations. And then pest species as well. That's mainly a problem due to our biosecurity methods. When we do move them from place to place, sometimes we get parasites and things coming with them when we move our oysters around, and that can cause issues as well. So lots of different reasons that our oysters are being depleted, but I would go back to that overfishing as your main one. So, fundamentally, it's all a bit depressing, but the point is we need to restore the native oyster. I hope that most people in this room agree with me. If you don't, then please ask me any questions at the end. We'll just presume that you do. And there's two major barriers to that. There's a lack of brood stock. We don't have many native oyster populations in the UK to get our oysters from, to then put them in new places to restore our oysters. Most of the oysters on the mainland of the UK come from Loch Ryan in Scotland, but they've only got so many oysters. So we've sort of got lots of different competing oyster conservation programmes competing for the same oysters coming from one place, which is a little bit of a barrier to it. But as we start to get those conservation efforts moving forward, then we can start selling on a little bit more of a broader market, hopefully. Then there's a lack of habitat as well. Now that's a lack of suitable habitat because of dredging, because of trawling and that kind of thing that's been destroyed. It's also a lack of just marine space out there with people like the MMO and things like that. You have to get licenses to do pretty much anything, and that includes restoration work. If a place is already licensed to be a fishing ground, you can't put oysters there because the fishermen want it. So it's a lack of actual habitat, and it's also a lack of perceived habitat as well, which is unfortunate in the way that it works. But lucky us, we've got the Wild Oysters Project to come and fix it. Now, the Wild Oysters Project is a national approach. We are in the Tyne and Wear, and we're down in Conway Bay as well. So we've got hubs in England and Wales, and they're pushed forward by local delivery partners. Up here, our local delivery partner is Groundwork North Eastern Cumbria. They do lots and lots and lots of really good work, including this. And then down in Conway Bay, it's Bangor University, which is my old stomping ground actually, so it's quite nice to go down there every now and then to see old friends and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the team. Amazingly, the entire project is ran by one lady in the Zoological Society of London called Celine Gamble, who works in London, but with the joys of modern technology, most things are done over Teams. Up in the Tyne and Wear, there's myself and Ben, and down in the Conway Bay, there's Ree and Maria. So the entire project is 5 people, none of which work full-time. So it's a very big project done by a very small number of people with limited time, which is quite interesting because we've actually done lots and lots and lots of really good stuff. So it just goes to show that you can do it with less people. And the reason that I do that, I'm going to hint later on, is through volunteers and their amazing work that they do for us. So the Wild Oysters Project, as an ambition, was sort of underpinned by this quote that came from the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem and Restoration. And I'm going to read the whole quote out, and we're actually going to unpick it a little bit because I think it's really important. It really shows what it is we're trying to do and why it is we're trying to do it. So the UK seas have self-sustaining populations of native oysters which provide clean water, healthy fisheries, plentiful biodiversity, and on land there's a reignited national love for this iconic species. That's the dream. That's what we want to get to. That's our end point. That's our desired goal. So self-sustaining populations of native oysters. We don't have to do anything. Basically, the goal is my job becomes redundant, in effect, because they're just doing it themselves, which is exactly what we're after. They will then provide more fish to go into our local fisheries, which means that our local fishers will have a lot more stock to bring on. They'll have a lot more money, a lot more business, that kind of thing. They'll also increase our biodiversity as a whole, which is always good for people like ourselves, conservationists, people that have interest in conservation. Will have this increased biodiversity and this reignited national love, this bringing back these ideas of the cultural value of the oyster and what it's able to do for our seas and us on land. So that's the idea. That's what sprung this whole project into action, was that one quote. And it's a three-pronged approach. Species reintroduction, so that's the oyster nurseries, which we're going to talk about as we go through this. Habitat restoration, which is the oyster reefs, which I'll continue to talk about. And public engagement and citizen science, which is sort of termed as oyster love, which is what you're all suffering through right now, this idea of public engagement. So as I said, we're a 2-man team up in the northeast. Amazingly, for all those women that are in the room that would like to go into STEM, before myself and Ben began, it was a fully female team that worked on the Wild Oysters Project. There were absolutely no men involved. I'm sure it's gone downhill since we started, but it was a fully female team, so absolute women in science is really, really important. Ben, he's a maternity cover for Ashley, so when she comes back, I'll be highly outnumbered. But yeah, so we're a small team, and there's just myself and Ben up here in the northeast. As I said, we're working for Groundwork North Eastern Cumbria, and then Zoological Society of London are the ones that are sort of funding us at the beginning of it all. And we're working along the Wear estuary and in inshore waters. So that picture there was taken at Sunderland Marina. And under Sunderland Marina, there are 30 nurseries, look exactly like the one we've got our hands on there. And in those 30 nurseries are just over 800 native oysters that are working to clean out the marina, to bring biodiversity back to the marina, and to reignite our love for oysters by bringing them up, showing them to community groups, showing them to school groups, and having volunteer days down there where people can really get involved in the project. Exactly the same as that is happening down in North Wales as well. The other thing we've got is about 1 kilometre off Whitburn. We have got a reef of 10,000 native oysters doing exactly the same thing. They're cleaning out the water, they're bringing back much needed native biodiversity to the waters just off Whitburn and the North East as a whole, and there are plans by the end of next year to put a further 20,000 into somewhere up the North East coast. So at the end of this, in the northeast of England, we'll have just over 30,000 oysters doing what they're doing. Believe it or not, that's quite a small project. The biggest one at the moment is down in the Humber, and they're looking at about 500,000 that they've currently got with scope to grow as well. So we're relatively small as far as the oyster conservation is concerned, but as I'll go into in a minute, there's a good reason for that. We are funded by an organisation called Stronger Shores. Stronger Shores is an organisation that focuses specifically on the North East. It's run by South Tyneside Council and the Durham Wildlife Trust, but with lots and lots and lots of other partners, including ourselves. The Tees Rivers Trust are our most southerly partners down in Middlesbrough, and then we've also got Durham Wildlife Trust. They fund a few PhDs at Newcastle University. They also fund some PhDs down in Plymouth University as well, and I'm sure I'm missing one or two other people as well. And their basic idea is to protect our coastline up here in the northeast from coastal erosion and flooding without the need for hard engineering. And they're using 3 species to do that. First one is being obviously the oysters. So oyster reefs, another thing they're really good at doing that I haven't even mentioned yet, is they deflect wave energy back out to sea rather than it hitting the coastline. Therefore, it reduces that erosion and reduces that flooding, as do seagrass meadows and as do kelp forests. So they're the 3 species that Stronger Shores are looking at in deflecting that wave energy back without having to build these big, destructive hard engineering projects. So that's sort of us, and that's our funder. So a bit more specifically into what we're doing and why we chose here. So we chose the North East for a few reasons. Number 1, the lovely people. Number 2, oysters as a whole. This is Pacific and European oysters and all the other types of oysters. If you look on that map on your left, are locally extinct, or were locally extinct. They just didn't exist up here. For whatever reason, in the northeast, our nearest Pacific oyster farm is in Lindisfarne, and then our nearest one to the south is just outside of Whitby. So there's a big area there where we just don't have any oysters. So we thought, perfect, empty canvas, plenty of place to start putting some oysters in. We also realised there's loads and loads of suitable sites. So these are all the sites here that the MMO said were suitable and licensed us for. You can see just up the top there, that is where we actually have our reef, just there off Whitburn. So there's a couple of reasons that we decided that this was the place to go. That sort of empty canvas type area, and the fact that there's loads and loads of different places where we can do it. There's also that local oyster history that I spoke about before. So you can see on the picture there, that's Oyster Shell Hall. That is that house that was in Sunderland with all those oyster shells encrusting it. And you can see the oyster saloon down there as well, which was a celebrated place for fish luncheons, the finest oysters, fried oysters and oyster stews, beer and lager beer, ale and stout. So sounds like quite a nice place to me. Shame they don't exist anymore. But that's what we used to have all those years ago. That map that you can see, all of the orange blotches are where we used to have oyster beds. So you can see there's not many places around the UK that didn't have them. The North East is no exception. We did have oyster beds here around that's sort of that 200 years ago mark. I believe that map is from 1883, but don't quote me on that. With those really big oyster populations over there, sort of in Denmark and Germany. But importantly, they were here in the North East, and we want to bring them back. So I spoke about that 3-pronged approach before, and I'm going to speak to you about it again, but much more on our sort of way of doing things. So we've got our oyster nurseries. I already spoke a little bit about them. They're under Sunderland Marina and over in Conway Bay, but most importantly, Sunderland Marina, and they're doing all of their amazing things. Seabed restoration, which are those 10,000 oysters that are currently down there just off Whitburn, and then the outreach, which is things like this, along with going to different school groups, having them come round, and different community groups and that kind of thing as well. And I will be going into more detail as we go forward. So, the oyster nurseries. They are micro-habitats of brood stock. So the idea of these nurseries is they are placed strategically so that the currents will move any larvae from the nursery to the reef. That's the fundamental idea of why we've got them. They're also there so that we can easily keep an eye on them. Once a month, we bring down several really hard-working volunteers from all across the North East and further. We've had people from Lancaster, we've had people from Lincoln come down just for the day to bring these oysters up. And what we do is we look at the biodiversity of the oysters, what animals are living on them, sessile biodiversity, along with that sort of that more mobile biodiversity, the fish, the crabs, that kind of thing. We look at the survival rate, how many survived since the last time, and then we also have a look at the relative growth rate as well, the presumptive growth rate as well. That takes us around 3-4 hours once every single month. And it's amazing. We've got a real community now. We've got a Facebook group with over 300 people in it. We've got a email list of just over 200 now people, and we see the same faces every time, and we see people that are friendly, and we have interactive conversation with people. And when people are out and about and they see oyster shells on the beach, they send it to us, or they see news about oysters that we weren't aware of, they send it to us. And we've got this real community going now around oysters, which helps people in the local area see it as their project, not just a project that's happening near them. It's their project, which is really important. Especially for such a small team, but I think important overall because it gives that ownership of the project. So yeah, 30 nurseries with, that says, over 700 oysters. We just had a recent restock, so I could change that number to an 8. It's just over 800 oysters now. And since we began this project around 4 years ago, they've produced around 3 billion larvae in that time. One oyster every single year. All the female ones, I say it's impossible to know how many female ones there are because they keep changing, but all the female ones will produce around 1 million larvae, which, it's a slight underestimation, really. Ours this year produced around 1.8 million larvae per oyster, and in Conway Bay they produced around 2.3 million larvae, so you can about double that. And you probably about double that number as well, because that's presuming around 1 million larvae per oyster, which is the standard sort of measurement that we go for. They produce larvae from when the sea gets above 15 degrees Celsius to when it drops below 15 degrees Celsius. And then me and Ben did weekly larval monitoring to see how many were producing larvae, how much larvae they were producing, and that kind of thing. So that's what the nurseries are there for. They're also there for engagement. We bring them up. It's amazing, especially for the younger people, the difference between me standing like this and boring you all with oyster facts and someone actually holding an oyster in their hand. The difference is absolutely incredible to how connected they feel to that project. I'm actually just going to mention one more thing on that. We also have started seeing in both sites European eels almost every single time we're doing this. They'll have probably gone back upstream now at this time of year, but they are a critically endangered species that are well high up on the red of the IUCN lists. So yeah, important to say that we're getting European eels that weren't in these marinas beforehand. Then the seabed restoration. So the first thing that was important was making that seabed suitable. To make the seabed suitable, we used local limestone that we basically got off, I think I've got a picture of it. Yep, there we go. Local limestone and scallop shells that we used a digger and a boat. I think there's around 100 tonnes there that were basically just put out to sea within a 75 metre cube, and then within a 25 by 25 metre cube we put the oysters straight on top, pretty much. They then floated down and started doing their thing. The reason we use scallop shells is, as I said, we've got a polymer broodstock. Oysters like to attach to oysters when they get to adulthood. If there aren't any oysters, the thing they like to attach to second best is scallops. So that's basically how the reef works, and you can sort of see the full process of that reef happening there. And then we've got our outreach and our education, which again is that really important bit. And I think for me, as an engagement officer, so I might be slightly biased, the most important part of any conservation is making sure that people are on side. That outreach and education doesn't just include the local community, as in bringing back that cultural value, We also have events and festivals. Myself and Ben have been out at marinas up at North Shields Marina, North Shields Fish Quay, up at Royal Keys Marina, down to Sunderland Marina as well, and Seaham, talking to local fishermen about the next project of reef development, making sure we knew where they were fishing, making sure we weren't going to disturb where they were fishing, and making sure that we basically had as much understanding as we did of the local fishing industry before we started doing these jobs. And we see that as really important, because if everyone's not on side, there's case study after case study where conservation projects fail because the local community either didn't want them to happen or weren't consulted about how they were going to happen. So it's important for us to not only teach the general public, as I'm hopefully trying to do now, but also have the general public teach us about how this project should be done to make it happy, to make it work for them. And that is an amazing piece of beach art that was done for our celebration event when our oysters first went down by Salter Sand, I believe the lady was called. Yeah, just there for you to look at, really. It was incredible. Around 80 foot high by, I think, around 60 foot or something like that. And here's a video of our nurseries. So these are up in Scotland. They're exactly the same as the ones that we use. And it's just basically to give you a little bit of an idea of the biodiversity that we see. So you can already see sea sponges and things like that. The outside of the nursery, that sort of caged area, is just made of metal. And then inside we've got some more like filamentous, almost sort of plasticky type stuff on the inside, where one oyster sits within each sort of level. You can see there's little levels there, there's one oyster in each one. And what we start to see, you saw a little prawn earlier if you were quick enough to glance at it, and then we sort of start to see these fish coming in. We do see animals that we didn't see before the project started, whether that's because we weren't surveying or whether it's because these oysters brought them in. We're not 100% sure, but it'd be nice to think that it was the oysters that did that. But they're certainly helping to clean up that water and giving different types of seaweed and different types of crabs and things an area to live on for these larger fish that are now coming in to feed upon the smaller fish. So yeah, it's absolutely amazing what's happening here of this biodiversity that is clearly using these oyster cages as a base of operations to feed on, to develop their own larvae, to develop their own young as nurseries, and just to attach on for those more sessile species. I'll let it play out because it's nice to see some fish. Yeah, you can see as well there, we've got things all the way up the trophic level there. We've got things from the bottom, from those seaweeds, all the way up to those much larger fish that are coming in to feed. So that trophic chain is represented all the way through. So I mentioned a little bit before about the citizen science. Well, the citizen science is a really important bit to us. It helps us to monitor the oyster nurseries. The idea of monitoring the oyster nurseries is, as much as it's nice to know how well the oysters are doing in the nurseries, it gives us an idea of what might be happening out to sea, where it's a little bit harder to monitor, a little bit harder to survey. So it works for both ways. And if we're keeping these guys alive, then we're also getting that sort of larval input to that oyster reef out to sea as well. So we monitor the survival, the mobile species and the sessile species, and we are looking at getting volunteers. When we get out there and we start surveying the reef with cameras, we've not done that yet, we've been more surveying with fish finders, things like that recently. But when we get out there and start surveying with cameras, we'd like to send those images and those videos to volunteers for them to have a look at the biodiversity is living on the reef as well. And there you can see how much fun everyone's having there. It is always this sunny. I know you all live in the northeast and you'll know it's always this sunny. Yeah, it's absolutely lovely. And you can also see there that we have volunteers all the way through the age ranges, really. We have students from, a lot of them from Newcastle Uni actually, on the marine biology programmes that are looking to get a little bit more experience, all the way through people that are already in the field, in sort of the middle-aged sort of area, and then we get the sort of retirees as well that are just really passionate about trying to help out where they can to make their local community better. So it's really nice to see people sort of from 18 up to, I think, 81 is our oldest volunteer, sort of helping each other out and working on this project as a group with those age divisions that are often there completely being dissolved by a really important project that everyone feels passionate about. So the timeline, and we are getting there. I've noticed the time, we're getting through the last sort of slides here. So we're aiming for this really long legacy. Currently funding is finishing us off in March 2026. We'd like to think that maybe we can continue our funding after that, but there's no guarantee. So at the moment we're working at that being an end date. And we are aiming for that long sort of legacy. So the idea is we are looking at producing a document of lessons learned, basically. As I say, we're a small organisation. We're not many people, and we're not doing a huge number of oysters. But the idea is when these bigger projects come in, these bigger organisations with these big, few £100,000 to £1 million sort of budgets, with a lot more oysters that they're able to do, rather than them wasting money on trying to work out what works and what doesn't, we've worked all that out for them. So we're very much pioneering this sort of idea. Oyster conservation is a new but very fashionable science at the moment. And a lot of these projects are quite small, and a lot of them are just trying to work out what works, so that when funding comes for those bigger ones, we can tell the people what works. So in January 2021, we installed our nurseries. In February of 2021, we then put our oysters into the nurseries. So there's about a month there for them to be down there to start weathering, basically, getting some species on them, making it a little bit more habitable for the oysters. We then did our baseline surveys in the spring of 2021 for the reef. You can see people out there on the boat using fish finders and using maps and things to work out where our oysters would be best placed. We then did our seabed restoration in the summer of 2021, where we began to put those things down. We then let that weather for quite a while, until about October 2024. We'd like to have done that a little bit earlier, but our licensing came out a little bit later than we'd like to, unfortunately, which I'm sure is something that anyone who's in the marine or any other field will completely relate to. Then in October 2024, we were able to put those 10,000 oysters down. And then, October 2024. That's not right, is it? So October 2024 now. October 2023 is when we put our oysters down. That makes more sense. And then into 2024 to 2026, we are continuing our monitoring and our outreach. And as I say, we do have these ideas of putting in more oysters into the future, both in nurseries. We've got some ideas about potentially putting some more nurseries into the Tyne and places like that, along with those bigger reefs as well. So, get involved is what we'd sort of like, really. If anyone here is interested, feels like they could do it, we'd love to get more volunteers. It's perfect for your students trying to bolster CVs. You'll be assessing that biodiversity, that survival rate, that growth, and you'll get a real opportunity to work sort of with local people within the industry, along with just meeting new friends and becoming part of a real community. That little bottom bit there is just for if there were any students here. We do have 2 places for placement students that are sort of opening up now. So we do have any students from Newcastle Uni. We'd love to have you. That'd be really interesting. But fundamentally, for all of you, we'd love you to get involved. It's the first Tuesday of every month, and you just have to drop me an email. And basically just, you come down, you have a lovely time, we'll have a cup of tea at the end, and we'll have a look at and chat about oysters for a few hours. It is really interesting and really enjoyable. And we get the same faces coming back month after month after month, which I hope means that they quite like doing it. If you can't do that sort of regular monthly thing, that's fine. I know it's a big commitment, that's absolutely not a problem. But what we do have is when we get those 20,000 oysters through, I mentioned earlier about biodiversity, biosecurity, and scrubbing these oysters, making sure they're clean before they go in. So in a few months, we're going to have 20,000 oysters to scrub, and we're going to have 2 days to do it before they die from being out of the water. So, if you'd like to come and get involved with that, we do it on sort of a little bit of a rotation system. You come in for a couple of hours, go home, come in for another couple of hours later on. I'll probably leave my email off with the society, and we'll hopefully send you some emails out to do that, because all hands on deck, really. Saves me and Ben doing 10,000 each. So yeah, that's another way that you can get involved that probably takes a little bit more time. So I'll leave this up. There's my email down at the bottom there, but there is also an email address there if you would like to get involved. If you'd like to follow us on social media, all our social media's there as well. And I believe that's me. Thank you very much.